Thank you very much, David. Just to give you a little bit of background, really most accountants don't have as many properties as I do, and we don't make that much money. It looks like there's a lot of stuff there, but in fact, my wife retired from teaching when she was 50, and basically she said, I think I can make some money on doing some property investment and things like that. So we bought our first place, a cottage in Bayfield, that was a place that we built in 1990 that was actually a duplex, and then rented it out for 10 years before we even occupied it. So that kind of got us started, and then we were avid people in Florida. So my 25-year-old son has spent 1 year in Canada for Christmas. So basically, we're never around over the Christmas holidays. So we ended up then loving the Keys and loving Florida, and knowing Florida, unlike most people that even live in Florida know. And then when Florida prices went crazy and I started to do the math on condos and things, I said, this condo is $650,000 US, and our dollar is 80 cents. I said, this is not likely that I'm ever going to be able to afford it. So basically then we went to Mexico, and we went to Baja, Mexico, and bought a home and about 600 feet of waterfront property down there for dirt cheap numbers, and you'll see the pictures later on. And then when the U.S. property disaster happened, we went back in the Keys and bought a place in the Keys as well. But all of our properties are rental properties. So we use them, but we also rent them out all the time. So our property in the Keys, for example, brings in about $25,000 a year. So it actually covers itself. Our property in Mexico only brings in about $8,000 a year, but in Mexico that's a lot of money and pays all the expenses. And our cottage brings in about $20,000 a year. And we still use them whenever we want to use them. So that's kind of my background that kind of suits me better than a lot of other people. And we do a lot of traveling, and we look into a lot of investment properties in different places, different countries, the Bahamas, Costa Rica, all sorts of places all over the place. So I'm going to try to make this kind of interesting if I can. And I do encourage people that if you do have a question or if you're unclear about something, you can go ahead and just put your hand up even during the speech. It's not going to throw me off that much because I'll wander a little bit as I go along. So that's basically where I started from right now. So because we got a few minutes as people are tailing in, I thought I'd give you that story. The other thing I'd like to know is I'm going to make you work. I'm going to make you have to put up your hand. What I'd like to get a feel for is what interests you have. So how many people are interested in cottages and transition, Canadian cottages and transition? Okay. So the headlines worked, David. And how many people are interested in buying property in the U.S.? Semi, so depends, right? Mexico, Bahamas, any place like that? Okay, so that's good. So the material that you have is way too long for the time that I have, but a lot of the stuff that's in there will tell you a lot of stuff about Mexico. I'm going to touch on the Bahamas and Mexico just fairly briefly then as I go along. Just because of your interest in cottage property. The interesting part is even for people with cottage property, I've got an interesting kind of slideshow here that says, here's a cottage in Muskoka. Here's what you can get for the same money in Florida, in the Keys and places like that. So a lot of times I've had people say, so what do you think? I said, well, I don't know. Like that drive up the 400, you can be in the Keys about the same time as you can do that drive in the 400 for sure. And you know it's always warm down there, so you don't have to worry about nasty shoulder weather or anything like that. So I get started, though, with the cottages. So before I go too far, one of my friends has a place in the Bahamas, and it's called Grand Isle. So to make you stay through all this boring presentation, we actually have a grand prize, which is a 7-day stay in Grand Isle. You'll see pictures of Grand Isle throughout here because they're one of the properties that we're comparing it to. So it's a 7-day stay. The cost is about $700 for the cleaning fee. You have to fly down there yourself and make all your meals. But basically, the condos that are there used to sell for $3 and $4 million. So it's really a top-end spot. I've stayed there myself, and it's really nice of Peter Nicholson to have offered this up as a prize for people. So we'll sort of go from there, and that'll be at the end of the presentation so people don't walk out on me. Hopefully that won't happen anyway. Okay, so this is me. This is my Mexican Mike persona standing beside like an outhouse. You can see the Pacific Ocean behind. And basically, I'm the National Director of Succession Planning for Collins Barrow, Certified Financial Planner, Trust and Estates Practitioner. I now have so many letters behind my name that for my daughter-in-law, when I sign a card, the last 3 letters are FIL, which stands for father-in-law, because it just goes crazy. So all these letters means absolutely nothing. So I just thought I'd let you know that too. So family dynamics in the cottage. So the key thing that we find out with a cottage is what it does is that a cottage or vacation property, whichever, keeps a common interest alive between all the family members. It's a center for the family to keep in touch, and it sucks them back from wherever they are. My 2 kids now, crazily enough, so we have all these properties right all over the place. My kids, one kid lives in Vancouver and works there with his wife. The other one just moved to Edmonton. So I'm kind of going, so why do I have this cottage on Lake Huron when they're gone? You know, but they do come back, and they love to stay there when they do come back and deal with things. But basically, for most people, it's a place to grab your kids and bring them back. And it's ingrained in our DNA as Canadians. It's a place to relax, get away from the busy city. It has increased in value over the years, and I think will continue to increase. It's where your children, and more importantly, your grandchildren, are going to want to come when you're older. I don't have any grandchildren yet, so I'm on that bad side. But basically, that's the reason that we love it. It's a place that's different from any other place. You know, when you say to the kids, well, come back to visit mom and dad in London, I don't get a lot of takers for that. In Toronto, you might. It's a little more vibrant and everything. But in London, it's really hard to suck them back. It's really easy when I say to them, hey, guys, do you want to go on a week's vacation down to Key Largo with us? Yeah, I'll do that. So it's a lot better. Same thing. Do you want to come up to the cottage for a week? It's a lot better draw for everything. So there's a picture of one of those Georgian Bay cottages that's so familiar to everybody. So death and taxes. So one of the problems that we find a lot of times with people is they want their kids to take on the cottage. And many times when I have this discussion with them, as I say, make sure they actually do want to keep it, and are they willing to pay for it? So many times I've sat there and I've had clients go, well, I want to keep the cottage, I want to pass it on to my kids. Then the time comes, they die, and their kids are sitting there going, you know, I have a mortgage to pay off. I have these other debts to pay off. I love the cottage. I'd like to keep the cottage, but I really can't afford it. So many times it's something where it's a dream in your lifetime, but it's not necessarily going to be reality with your kids. They can indicate that they want to keep the cottage, and many times I have that hard conversation with them. I said, well, you want to, but are you willing to have that investment in your life? You know, cut the lawn, keep it, maintenance, everything else. So it's always a problem. And do they want to share it? Does one want to own more? They always have a lot of conflicts between them when it gets into that. So the other thing is that, as in my case, I've got a son in Vancouver. My son in Edmonton might come back towards Ontario, but it's kind of like, what do you do with the son in Vancouver? Well, in my case, I have a place in Baja, and Baja is like Florida for people on the West Coast. So I've kind of got one property for my son in Baja and one property for my son down here, if they want it. At this stage, neither of them want the cottage. So it's kind of funny that, you know, that they want the other properties that may be there. And again, whether they'll do it or not. But if you transfer it to them jointly, how do they share in the maintenance costs? How do they deal with those costs? One wants to upgrade and build a bigger cottage. The other one doesn't mind the old cottage. You choose your friends, not your family. So a lot of times, and you've probably seen that with your kids, I'm lucky my kids are their best friends, so they work. But a lot of people, it's just not the case. So if they get along well and have few conflicts and similar values, it might work. The likelihood of any more than 3 getting along together to own a cottage jointly is pretty small. So if you have a family of like 4 or 5 kids, good luck with that, because their income is all different, everything is all different across the board, so it's very unlikely that they're going to get along. You can't control conflict after your death. So everybody always says, I don't want to cause problems on my death with the cottage. And so many people put in so many rules into their will that it handcuffs their executors, handcuffs their kids. So you have to be very careful, I think, when you're dealing with all that sort of stuff. And you have to consider how to fund the cottage expenses. So sometimes I've seen people where they say, well, I'm going to leave $250,000 in an account that's there to fund the cottage expenses. So the kids can't touch it. It's just there for the cottage expenses things. And that seems to work fairly well for some people, but sometimes the kids are kind of going, well, I could use that money for other purposes. You know, I got kids going to school, I got all these other problems. So that's really something that occasionally does happen. It's best to lay out the rules in advance. So in this case where we had a client leave the cottage to a trust, and also leave a sum of money to the trust to finance the cottage. We literally said, we need rules. Who uses it the most often? Who's allowed to use it? Who gets the peak weeks? Who gets the other weeks? You have to deal with all that kind of stuff as you're going along. So death and taxes. There's a tax-free rollover that's left if the cottage is transferred to your spouse. So most of the time you leave the cottage directly to your spouse. She, normally it's a woman, has to deal with this afterwards, and then they're the ones that basically have to deal with it within their will. So cottages are subject to capital gains taxes. 1/2 of the gain will be taxable. You can't transfer for tax purposes at anything less than fair market value. Transfer into joint names with the kids is still a disposition unless it's done properly. So I've had tons of people where they go into their lawyer. Are there any lawyers here? Oh, nuts. Okay. So they often go into their lawyer, and in some cases they'll go into like a real estate practitioner or somebody else, and they'll say, sure, transfer it to your kids. Don't worry about it. It's not going to be a problem. Well, there are tons of pitfalls to watch out for in all these things that I'll get into a little bit later, which the lawyers will probably understand as they're doing it. But everybody does this where they just say, well, I'll just transfer it. Just transfer title and that's fine. Well, that's a deemed disposition for tax purposes, and you have to pay tax on it. But CRA doesn't catch these all the time. So many times they'll just go through, and we'll end up with a new client or somebody coming along, and they'll say, yeah, 2 years ago I transferred my cottage. I said, well, when did you buy the cottage? 1965. What was it worth? Oh, about $800,000. I said, like you owe like $200,000 in tax. They say, well, no, I transferred it to my kids. They didn't pay me anything for it. That doesn't work. It's a deemed disposition on death. So it's really important that people realize to get good advice when you're talking to everybody about that. So for all this stuff, your advisors have a plan. This is a picture of my favorite birds in Mexico. There are lots of birds in Mexico, which is one thing it does have. So one thing that a lot of people don't utilize enough or work with is the thing called the principal residence exemption, which can be elected on any property used principally for personal use. So even your property in Florida, your property in Mexico, your cottage property, your house in Toronto or whatever, all of those properties, as long as you use them from time to time, you can elect your principal residence election on. I don't recommend it for U.S. properties because you have to file a U.S. tax return to report your gain in the U.S. So it really normally only works on your Canadian cottage property and your principal residence. So I've just got a quick example here where you own the cottage since 1991. The cost is $160,000. You sold your original house for a large gain in 1996, and then you moved into a condo in 1996. You sold your current condo in 2011, but the gain was only $20,000. So this is a perfect kind of situation, and you plan on selling the cottage in 2015 with a $200,000 gain. So there's a lot of tax payable on that cottage at that time. So the key in all of this, and I'll go into this later, is to keep track of your expenses on all your properties, including your house or condo in Toronto. The total tax, if you use your principal residence election on your condo, which you sell first, ends up being about $35,000. So the bottom line, and this actually really gets into a lot of the numbers, but by not electing your principal residence exemption on your condo and saving it for your cottage, you can save $23,000 in tax. So the big thing that I try to get out of this, and I sort of go through this all the time, is when you sell a property, think about which property has the biggest capital gain in it. So many people that have bought and sold properties in bigger cities and things like that. Yes?
Just a question related to principal residence.
Yep.
How loose is the definition of principal residence? I would have thought it to be primary residence.
No, it's not. Really, for a principal residence, and it's actually the same thing in divorce, is it's if you habitually use it for personal purposes. So if you spend 2 weeks a year in that cottage, it can be elected on as your principal residence. Yes?
So don't you have to elect on that every year?
Nope. No, only when you dispose of a property. That's the big deal, and I'll get to that in a minute. Yep.
In Canada, would it matter if it was different provinces?
Nope. No, doesn't matter. Like I can elect on my place in Florida. I can elect on any place that I habitually use. So even though my cottage is also a rental property, and it's a duplex and it's complicated with all that kind of stuff, because I've used it myself for a couple weeks a year, I can elect on it to be my principal residence. Sure.
And maybe you're going to get to this a little bit later in this exact example, but in this particular case, why wouldn't somebody elect the condo as their principal residence, as their primary residence, and then when they sell the cottage, they have to make another election anyway?
Well, the difference is that it's based on the number of years of ownership. So there's a complicated calculation that's in here that talks about 1 plus the number of years that you've owned the property. So essentially, even though you own the cottage from 1991 to 2015, from 96 until 2015, you can elect for those years to elect on that cottage gain. And what it does is it grinds down the capital gain for tax purposes. So the principal residence, it's really a good tool to use, but it's complicated. And the times when it's important is every time you sell a property that could be a principal residence. And I've had this many times where people say, I had one client with a cottage up in Muskoka, or not Muskoka, but in Tobermory. And they said, well, I'm flipping this condo. I've lived in this condo for 10 years. My gain is very small. And I've said, great, we're going to use the condo, and that'll save her about $35,000 in tax on the cottage. Because in those years when she was living in the condo, she's able to elect the principal residence to be her cottage instead. So it's really a powerful tool. Yes, sir.
What about if the husband has the house and the wife has the cottage?
No, they changed that rule in 1982. So, but that's in here too. So I've got that. So you can't split it. Husband and wife only have one principal residence exemption. Sometimes it's worthwhile divorcing to get two, but we don't really recommend that because it's very expensive. Very expensive. So these are the boring details that I'm not going to bore you with, but this is how the math works on this. But it's really something for people to watch over and to watch. And that's why I call it a boring detail, because it's boring to this pelican. So this is all more of this where you elect on the condo. So essentially what you do is you pay tax on your condo on your lowest capital gain to save up your years for when your cottage is sold to have more. For many people, I've said things like once you've got the condo or once you've maybe gone to a rental apartment, keep that cottage as long as you can, because every year that you own it, your capital gains tax decreases as you're going along. So it's spectacular. It's a really good tool to use, and not too many people use it. Okay, divorce and recreational property, since we were talking about divorce. For marital purposes, a cottage or recreational property is also family property. So the problem is the principal residence rule catches you both ways. So when a child may inherit, buys, or is gifted a property, provided it's used for enjoyment of their family, even if it's only for a week a year or 2 weeks a year, it's included in family property, even if it's gifted, bought, or inherited from the parent. So a lot of times people think, and especially we accountants, will often use a tool where we'll say we can gift shares of a corporation to our child after they're married. If we gift shares to a corporation after they're married, we designate in a gift rule, we say these shares are not to form part of family property, and you can say that. But for a principal residence, you can't say it, so you have no way out of that. So you have to be very, very careful, because if there's a divorce, half of that property can go to the spouse.
Just a question. So if someone comes into ownership of, say, half of a cottage before they get married.
Yeah, then it's the value of the cottage at the date of marriage. But even after that, if you use it as a principal residence, habitually are there for enjoyment purposes, it gets tied in. So you kind of get snookered. You have to be really careful with these properties as you're going along. So the reason I say that appearances can be deceiving, this is a loving picture, right? Except for one thing, the seal's dead. So just imagine that you leave the property to your 2 children. One gets divorced and has to pay half the value to the spouse. What do they do now? So how do they come up with the money to be able to buy the spouse out of that cottage? A marriage contract may work, but it must be finalized before the wedding. For our lawyers that are in the house, they are a pain in the butt to get a marriage contract. I've had to do several over my years, and it's one of the most painful things I've ever had to do. And you often end up losing a client because you try to do it. So it's difficult to do marriage contracts in any situation, It's especially difficult if you're targeting a cottage as the reason that you're doing the marriage contract, regardless of how much it's worth. So here's the strategy that we've developed over the years, that if the cottage is intended to be gifted during the lifetime, don't gift it to them outright. Lend money to the kids to buy the cottage. So essentially what you've got is you may give them an $800,000 cottage, but they owe you a promissory note that's an $800,000 note. You can put a mortgage on the property if you want to protect yourself a little bit that they keep it. But basically, just by doing that note, you're able to reduce the value of that gift and that property using the family property rules by the amount of the debt. So it offsets the debt. So it actually works out fairly well. You may have to pay the land transfer tax. Lawyers know that land transfer tax is a funny kind of thing. And in some cases, what I've said to people is, because the land transfer tax on an $800,000 place is like $10,000 probably, depending on where it is. And essentially what I say to people is I say, get the promissory note after you've transferred it. So transfer it as a gift and then take the loan. It's a bit of a stretch, but it's something where if you don't want to pay the $10,000 or $12,000 in land transfer tax, at least there's a promissory note there showing it afterwards. It's not tied into consideration or anything. Yes?
Is there a prescribed rate on that loan?
No, because it's personal property. There's no rate. There's nothing. So you don't have to worry about it. It's personal. You can gift to your kids or give your kids loans or do anything that you want for, there's no prescribed rate, no nothing. Spouses are different. That's where they use it, is for spouses. So that's where the prescribed rate rule comes in. So the cottage loan is joint. After death, normally you would forgive that loan. So then it all goes back to the kids again. So basically the wife is then able to get it unless you have some bizarre arrangement where they're supposed to pay back the spouse or something like that, or one of the other kids. So there's the kids. That old boat there is a 1966 Bertram that I found in Florida for like $8,000. Perfect. And those were not all my kids.
So you give the cottage for $800,000 to take security back for $800,000.
Yeah, or just a promissory note. It doesn't even have to be secured. Just by both of them. In other words, both the wife and the husband.
You forgive it by will.
Yes.
And in any event, capital gains is paid when I gift it.
Yes, exactly.
At the fair market value.
That's right.
So if I gift it at $500 and it's deemed to be $800, I still pay the capital gains on the $800.
That's right, exactly. So you may as well take the promissory note back for $8 for the whole amount. Yep.
Is there any income on the loan forgiveness though?
Nope, not on death. Not on death. So the other thing that people are often interested in is the avoidance of probate. So probate fees in Ontario are 1.5% of the assets. If the property is joint with your spouse, there's no probate fees until the last spouse dies. So when you're looking at things, you always have to be careful because people flip stuff into joint name. Investment brokers are renowned for it. I know I have a lot of investment brokers here too. But a lot of times people do things where they put stuff into joint name and they say, oh, we're going to save the probate. It's 1.5%. Let's save that. But what happens is whenever you do anything into joint name, it takes it right out of the will. So we'll spend time, the lawyers and I will spend time, and we'll work up this beautiful will and charge the client $25,000. And the investment brokers and a real estate guy will say, well, let's put everything into joint name just to get out of this whole problem. Well, then the property goes to whoever is on joint title. Basically, your whole estate plan goes to hell in a handbasket, and it's gone. So you have to be careful when you're looking at things like that because the transfers to joint name sometimes leave assets out of the will. So don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, which happens a lot of times when people say it. And they, like I've had it where I've seen people where the husband said, I want to gift this to this charity and this to this charity and this to this charity. They put everything into joint name at the end, and the wife says, I don't want to do that. And she doesn't have to because there's no money left in the will to do all this stuff. Then you can end up in a fight with the charity as well, who will say, well, you didn't, really it wasn't a transfer of joint property, etc. So just be careful with that. Be careful with probate planning. And this is a recent problem that has come up. It's not so recent now. I'm sorry, yes?
Probate fee, is that a mandatory situation, or you just find an insurance policy to clear the will?
It's pretty much mandatory for real property. And most of the banks and financial institutions will not charge or will not transfer significant amounts of money without you having the rights to administration.
In fact, every lawyer you deal with insists on probating a will.
Exactly.
Actually, it's unnecessary in the majority of cases.
Sometimes it all depends on the assets that are there. If they're corporate assets, you can have a separate will for a corporate asset and get out of that. But certainly it's very difficult because most of the time the financial institutions will not transfer to you without probate unless it's under an amount of $50,000 or something like that. If it's a big amount, the financial institutions just say, yes, we have a will. We don't know if there's another will that's out there, and we don't want to take the responsibility for transferring to the wrong person. Yeah, that's another story. I can go into that in a whole other speech. So one of the problems that has come up, and I don't know why the judge did this when he did the ruling, but essentially what they did was they said that if you transfer a property into joint name, the courts now will assume that it's not intended to be a legal transfer. So it's exactly the opposite of what you would think. So if you go through and if you do a transfer to one of your sons, just say, okay, I'm going to pay tax on my cottage. I want Ben to have my cottage. I'm going to transfer it to him right now into joint ownership with he and I. So because it's joint ownership and because it's a real transfer, you have to pay tax on half the gain. But at least you're only paying tax on half the gain. The other half comes in when you die. So essentially you do that and you say, so my intention is that Ben inherits this cottage 100%. Well, the courts will assume that if there's no evidence to the contrary, that is not a valid transfer. So Ben's brother, Jake, can come back and say, no. That cottage has to be included in that property because the courts say that if it's transferred into joint name, it is not intended to be a transfer for real purposes. So it's bizarrely opposite to what anybody would think. And people get caught on this all the time. I've even seen a couple lawyers where they get caught on it because they get confused. They say, this doesn't make any sense. I say, yeah, you're right. But unfortunately, that's the way that the law is right now. So you have to be careful because the courts assume the asset should still be included in the estate. So it's not the sole property of son number one, but the sibling beneficiaries have an interest in the property. So the way that you get around that is you document your intent. Yes?
It's not a transfer for legal purposes, but as far as Revenue Canada is concerned, it's an actual disposition for tax purposes?
Well, that's the interesting part is that if you transfer, as long as you say what your intent is, so in other words, you can transfer into joint name to avoid probate by saying within the document, it's not my intent to truly transfer this property. I'm solely doing it for probate purposes. Now, the new Probate Act may be throwing all this stuff out, because it's looking through, it may look through corporate wills, it may look through an awful lot of other stuff. But under the old legislation and common law, this is essentially what it was. So for Revenue Canada purposes, you can say, I can transfer it to them, and as long as I document my intent, so have the lawyer or the accountant witness a document that says my intention is I'm only doing this for probate purposes. So because I'm doing that, it's not a disposition for tax purposes. So that's okay to do. Yep.
Let's say you bought a cottage for $500,000 and spent for 5-6 years. Now the cottage is worth $2.5 million.
Yep.
So now the capital gain is going to be between that $500,000 and
That's right.
$1 million.
That's right.
Can you still do it?
If you haven't sold your principal residence in the meantime, you can use your principal residence exemption on that quick flip.
What happened when I said
Yeah. So that's something just to bear in mind. So anyway, so what you have to watch out for is watch out for this estate litigation, creating problems in your estate. You can use an alter ego trust, which may be set up to avoid probate, but you still owe capital gains tax on death when it goes from, to the kids in the end. So there's one of those other little cottages there. So cottage tax strategies. So the other thing that how many life insurance people are here? Gotta have a couple. Come on, they always come. Okay. Is to consider life insurance. Of course, the problem is we always consider life insurance when we're like 60 years old, and it's really costly to do it. Maybe the kids will pay the premiums if they want to pay the tax on it. So you transfer the cottage to the kids before the gain gets too large. transfer it outright to joint name is also an alternative. If you've got a place that's appreciated in value a large amount, basically, other than working with your principal residence exemption, there's no way to get out of it. It's just impossible to avoid that tax legally. Yes?
So you say you transfer it over to joint name. What if you were about to buy some vacant cottage property? Could you put your children's name in right at the inception?
Yep, exactly. You can gift property. Now, if the kids are under 18, you have to form a trust for it or hold it in trust for the kids and things like that, which you can do, which does help a little bit. So the kids don't have to put up the money, but you have to watch it if they're minors. Like if they're over 18, there's no problem. You can give a kid that's over 18 a gazillion dollars and it doesn't matter. There's no problem with it at all. And they can give you money as well. So we recommend that you take a promissory note to protect people for divorce and for creditor proofing purposes. A joint tenancy puts all of you at risk if there's financial or marital difficulty. So I've seen it before where people say, well, I'm going to put all four of us on the cottage. My two kids, my wife and myself. And their kids are younger. They're like 20 years old. Then one of the kids gets into financial difficulty, and the banks come back looking, and they say, oh, you own a quarter of a cottage worth $800,000. Somebody has to pay $200,000. So again, if you document your intent, that's fine. But if it truly is going to be their property, you have to be careful with that because that creates a lot of problems. When the kids need the money, they're still kind of going, well, I have $200,000 here of value in this cottage, Dad. You gave it to me. Gee, I'd like my money out. And then that too can lead to litigation, could lead to all kinds of problems. Make your intent clear. Make sure that it must be a real transfer to minimize capital gains tax. Watch out for co-owners that may go to court to force a sale. I can tell you a story about an island up in Muskoka where it was owned by 3 siblings, and now there's each sibling had 4 kids, and there's like 15 owners of this island, of which 2 of them are U.S. citizens, which creates a whole different problem, and it is just ugly. So really be careful when you're thinking about these kind of things as you're dealing with them. For the operation of the cottage long-term, consider a co-ownership agreement to outline the expectations for who pays the bills, who cuts the lawn, who pays for renovations, restrictions on sales. Sometimes Dad will say, like in my case, I've transferred my Mexican property to my 2 sons because I don't want to have the problem with my estate dealing with Mexican property. So I've done that transfer, and now I'm kind of saying, well, that's nice. If they want to sell it, they can sell it, and I can't go there anymore. So it becomes a little bit of a problem. So sometimes you take back a promissory note just so that you can say, well, if you sell it, at least you got to pay me back some money. So I'll have some money out of it if you do that and if I don't want you to do it. But the kids have to agree. There's a little bay just off our place in Baja where there's about 1,000 sea lions and young little babies like this. Yes?
Just back on the other slide, make your intent clear, i.e. must be a real transfer to minimize capital gains. I'm not grasping the distinction between a real transfer and an unreal transfer.
Well, remember that when you transfer it into joint name, you need to document what your intent is. If you don't document that intent, they assume there's no transfer. So essentially, you may sort of pay the capital gains tax on it when, in fact, the Ontario courts will say there was no transfer, and the federal courts and the tax courts will say, yes, there was. So you get into this dichotomy of an argument and those things. So basically, the kids have to agree long term. Yes? Yep. Technically, you can't avoid land transfer tax when you transfer title and take back consideration. So sometimes what I've done is I've done the transfer as a gift, and then the day after the gift, I've had the kids sign a promissory note to show that their intention is that they're buying the property. I register it on title first, and then after it's registered on title as a gift, basically the kids, give a note back at that particular time. And there's even a question of whether that's legitimate for probate purposes. There's also a question if you went into a divorce court, whether the judge might say, well, what was the consideration for that spouse signing that promissory note? So it's fraught with little problems, but
Change your mind between being a gift and a loan. Day after.
like the problem with going into divorce courts on stuff like that is that literally it's up to the interpretation of the judge. If the judge says she signed this promissory note fully, willingly knowing what she was doing, it's kind of hard for them to throw it out, I think. But, depends on the lawyer, depends on what's going on. So I caution people on that. And normally I'll say the only real way to do it best is to pay the land transfer tax. But many people say, I hate land transfer tax. That's crazy to pay $12,000 for nothing. And I tend to agree with them sometimes.
Both people that, let's say the cottage is both names, both have to sign.
Exactly. The husband and the wife have to sign. Yes, at the back. There really isn't much. Actually, I'm coming up to the trust for a cottage now, so there really isn't much difference that way. Well, except that, let me get to the trust part. I'll show you what the sort of benefits of that are. Cottage trust, look at that. Appropriate that you ask that question on an inter vivos basis. So what happens with a cottage trust, which a lot of advisors are using for cottages, is it's still a deemed disposition. So you're still paying capital gains tax on it. It works if you're buying a cottage now, or should the gain be fairly small, or if you can use your principal residence exemption now to shelter that, then that makes some sense to do. You still take back a demand mortgage to defer any gain over 5 years. So you can do that where you can slowly bring your gain in if you sell to the trust and have a capital gain, which many people will have. The mortgage also gives you more control over the property than even the terms of the trust. So inside the terms of the trust, you can say things like, well, I get use of the property, et cetera, et cetera. The trust normally needs to be dissolved after 21 years. And being in practice for me about 35 years, I've got more of these 21 years sneaking up on me than I ever believed I'd ever have. So it's kind of funny. It sounds like a long time, but it really isn't. And the assets must be transferred to the kids or tax paid on the accumulated gain at that time. There are ways to stagger the trust where you can put in place another trust and another trust and another trust to extend it, but I've always questioned that a little bit. It may protect you somewhat, like against a claim by a child spouse. So with a cottage trust, it's a discretionary trust. So if you have 3 kids that are in that trust, you can say, I can choose which of you kids are going to inherit this property and be transferred this property out of the trust later on. Well, what's happened in the divorce courts is that many times we've said things like, well, let's set up 3 trusts, 1 for each kid, to own an interest in the property. Well, wasn't one of my clients, was actually one of my clients on the other side. They did the same thing. They set up 1 single trust for 1 child. And in the divorce courts, we basically said, how can you argue that this isn't that child's property? There's only 1 beneficiary. If there's only 1 beneficiary, how can you say that there's discretion to transfer it to other beneficiaries? So you're normally better to have a trust with like 2 or 3 beneficiaries in there. Then your argument with the spouse is, who says that your husband or wife is going to be the one that gets that property? Therefore you can argue that it's not family property potentially at that time. But again, judges tend to look through a lot of this stuff a lot of times, and it's very fraught with danger. Yes, definitely. As long as the kids are the right age for that 21-year rule to happen, and that's kind of part of the problem sometimes. So certainly skipping a generation works if you do dispose of it, and if you say, I want this to be around for a long time. You can also have multiple beneficiaries of the trust, which includes the next generation. So it does actually work fairly well in that case. So it is something to consider. Now, one of the problems is that the parents kind of maintain control over the property during the life of the trust, should set out clearly the cost of operation and who pays what, who gets whatever, when. Granting a life interest to a parent is no longer an alternative. So back a number of years ago, lots of cottages got transferred, and basically they said, well, I'm going to transfer the cottage, I'm going to grant a life interest to the parent. So when you get your appraiser in place, you say, well, really, what's the value of the disposition when you grant a life interest in the property? So it gets to be complicated. Canada Revenue Agency has put the blocks to that one, basically, so you can't do that anymore. So life interests don't work. Lots of lawyers will say, yeah, go ahead and take it back with a life interest. They just remember lawyers are not all tax lawyers. They're real estate lawyers, they're other people. Good lawyers will say, there might be something wrong with that, check with your accountant. So the big key is to sort of check with your accountant on everything that you're doing whenever you're looking at any of this stuff. So the child may use the principal residence exemption. So it always used to be a great strategy because you'd say, well, one of my children is habitually using the property, and as a member of the trust, they can use their principal residence exemption to avoid all this tax. So let's assume that you buy a property today for $500,000. It appreciates up to be worth $1 million. You buy it using a trust, and then you say, well, we want to sell it. Well, then you say, great, I can now use the child's principal residence exemption, and that $500,000 gain is totally tax-free. That's a great strategy. The only problem is that once that child uses that principal residence for those years, so do all the other children. So you have to be careful. If you have 3 kids, they all get kind of branded with using their principal residence exemption, which may not matter depending on what property they own and things like that. But cottage trusts are a great strategy because of that capital gain out where the kids can use their principal residence exemption. Especially when they're younger, it works very good. And the trustee can choose which child or all will be entitled to the cottage when it's distributed. This is our cottage up in Bayfield that our kids are not fighting over. So the pros and the cons of trusts, they're fairly costly to form and to maintain. Normally the cost of a family trust is about $1,700 to $2,000, or even a little bit more in some cases. You have to keep good records on everything. You have to keep track of everything that's going on. You should do that anyway. It only lasts for 21 years. It deals with capital gains and with probate issues. So if you die, the trust owns the property, not you. You don't have to worry about probate. You don't have to worry about capital gains or anything. And you may be able to skip a generation to the grandchildren. The transfer is not taxable. So this is a great strategy. The transfer is taxable, so it's not such a good strategy if there's a huge gain in the property already, unless you think it's going to continue to appreciate. So testamentary trusts. These are after death. So this is a case where husband dies, leaves all the property to his wife except the cottage that he leaves to his 2 kids. Deemed disposition on death, has to pay tax on it upon death. May be funded by the estate and costly to maintain. So just as I said to you before, somebody can leave it to their kids. Some people have actually left dollars there to maintain the cottage for them. There's still a matter that long-term you have to deal with that trust. The trust, even in a testamentary trust in that case, only lasts for 21 years. So your executor, trustee of that trust, has to decide which of the kids is going to get it or basically distribute it to both kids. It's complicated and ugly, but it does work in some situations. Certainly you can skip a generation, but the 21 years crunches up on you pretty fast depending upon how old your kids are. So these are tips for recreational and principal residences, and this is the most important thing, that if you take anything out of this, keep copies of documents for all your renovations to your house and to your cottage. Everybody throws that crap out. And they say, like I remember talking to them about, well, did you do any renovations? Well, yeah, we put a kitchen on in like 1996. I think it was about $80,000. I said, well, do you have any documentation of it? No. So all that sort of stuff, try to keep a running total of what your cost is, even if it's on a spreadsheet, even if you don't keep the copies of the bills. If you can go back and say, I did this kitchen in 1996, it cost $100,000. CRA, look at the kitchen. You know what kitchens cost at that time? Can you buy my argument? And they normally will. Sorry? No, you can't include property unless it's bare land. If it's bare land, you can. That'll get added to the cost base potentially. Yeah, but only if it's bare land. So don't bother keeping track of carpet, roofs, and things like that. Every time you sell a principal residence, review if you should use that election on the property. Yes? Yep, absolutely. It's part of your principal residence. Or a part of your cottage. So other tips, and this is where the two-spouse actually works, and many younger people will not remember this, but back prior to 1982, you each had your own principal residence exemption. That law has continued. So essentially, if you owned a place from 1965 on, if you had put your principal residence in your wife's name, your house, and your cottage in your name, that's okay. That's kept the two properties segregated. So the gain up until 1982 is protected. So this is something that a lot of us forget because time goes by, right? That's 1982 is a long time ago, right? But it's, yep. It's 82 for this one. So there's also a 1971 valuation date. So there's a 1971 valuation date. There's also a 1982 valuation date. And the silly part is that CRA has kind of been playing with this rule funny, where they've kind of said, if when you dispose of the cottage, if it's in only one spouse's name, and if you own two properties prior to that date, even though you may not have played by the rules for the intervening years, you can use that 1982 cost basis. So, and that saves a lot of money because 1982, real estate prices kind of went like the 1970s went zing like this to 1982, then they went up to 89 and then went down and flat. So when you think about it, there's lots of valuation in there for 82 that you can argue for a fairly good exemption. Again, it's little known. A lot of people don't use it, but it's something that people should really remember. Ensure that at the time of death on sale that the property is held in only one person's name. So again, here's that dichotomy happening where for this 1982 rule, if you own two properties before 1982 and want to use this stepped up cost base, before you die, you transfer it out of joint name into your individual name, but that means that you have to pay probate on it then. So there's all these sort of cost-benefit analysis that you have to do when you look at this sort of stuff. Sometimes it makes sense to pay the probate fees on that cottage to get that bump up in the cost base, especially if you bought one of those 1966 specials, right, for like $35,000 that's appreciated up to be worth $800,000. So it can be well worth it. Also, remember that your cost base is in 1971, valuation at that date. And many of you, again, as time goes by, we forget stuff. Back in 1994, there was the ability to elect the $100,000 election, capital gains exemption on any property. So many of our clients use that on their cottages. Their current accountants have that record in their files. Then they change accountants. So it's a good reason not to change accountants. And I always tell people. Because they just lose that fact and they forget about it. So most people did elect in 1994 on cottage property if they own cottage property and didn't have a lot of other investments. So again, that's another way that property value gets boosted up over time. And the tax is expensive. No. It died in 1994. So you had your final kick at the cat in 94 to do that election on recreational property or any other type of property. So we're at 6 o'clock now. Would you like to take a little break right now? And then I'll go into U.S., or do you want to continue for a few minutes and then we'll... Keep going. Okay. So U.S. Recreational property, the good. The lowest prices in years and Canadian dollar is above par. There's a strong disconnect between U.S. and Canada right now. I'll show you some of the prices in just a minute, and there has been a disconnect in the last number of years. Low interest rates, it's hard to borrow in the United States. You can now borrow by paying 30% down in the U.S., which just changed very recently, but it takes them 3 months to approve the mortgage. So it's a bit of a pain. So for most people looking at buying property in the U.S., I say use a line of credit on your cottage, use a line of credit on your house, borrow here to buy down there. Buy property in the U.S. with cash deals. Only if you're using it for rental purposes like I am. So that's why we do this stuff. So the prices have bottomed. There are good deals there, but there's less than before. Some places like Sarasota, Siesta Key, different places like that are getting a little bit hot. There are starting to be multiple offers. The prices have not recovered anywhere near to where they were, but the market's just getting a little bit hotter. As the backlog of seized and short sale properties decrease, prices will increase. So does anybody want to know what a short sale is? No? Okay. There are two kind of distressed sales in the U.S. One's a foreclosure where the bank spends a lot of money to foreclose on the property. They have total control over it. The other is a short sale where essentially the owner of the property goes into the bank and says, look, I'm not going to pay you back. I want to sell this property. You don't have to foreclose on it. I'm going to try to sell it, and you're going to approve that sale when I sell the property. We bought a short sale. The problem with the short sale in the United States is that the bank is in the driver's seat. Real estate agents hate short sales, but tell them, tough shit, I'm going to do it anyway, because the short sales are well worth it. The problem with a short sale is you make your offer, the bank kind of goes, I'll think about it for a while. And they think about it for up to 6 months sometimes, and it can take forever and a day. Also, the risk is that the owner of that property can trash the place, and they have absolutely nothing to lose. So you have to be really careful. Ours worked out okay, but in the end, we did this deal where we said, we want all this furniture, we want this, we want that. They came back, they said, okay, the bank accepted after only 2.5 months, which was good. Then the owner said, well, we're not going to give you the furniture. I said, well, what do I do now? And they basically said, you can't do anything. Like either you close or you don't over the furniture. And of course, the individuals don't care because it's the bank that's losing $350,000 in this deal. So it's just a big problem, which is why they don't like short sales. But there's still a place to get the good deals that are out there all the time. As short sales happen in buildings and condos and properties, any property that's under foreclosure or a short sale tends to hold down the value of a complex. So a lot of times you can get a hell of a deal where there are places where there are like 2 places that are under bank seizure because they're trying to unload it as fast and as cheap as they can. As soon as all these short sales float through the system and these people get out, property values are going to take a substantial leap in Florida because the people that have bought on all these short sales don't want to sell cheap anymore. So this is starting to wear through, that the short sales are becoming less and less and harder to find, less foreclosures and things like that. So the Florida Keys, Naples, Sarasota, Miami are recovering. Cape Coral still has 17 years of inventory left over. Sales in Florida generally are 1/3 of people moving to upgrade, 1/3 buying second homes, 1/3 investors willing to flip. So there's still a lot of flippers happening in the U.S. right now, still a lot of them. So the prices have leveled off, with some actually starting to increase in some areas. So in the Keys, you can buy waterfront property starting at $300,000, non-waterfront from $150,000. It's a 50% discount from on high. So when people talk about it, you talk to real estate agents over there, they talk about 30% discount, 40%. It's half price compared to the prices in 2006 and 2005 and 7. So the good part about the Keys is the water temperature, 75 to 90 degrees, air temperature, 75 to 90. It's cottage country for Florida, but there are no beaches. There are dolphins, though. So that's the good. So the bad, if you rent your property in the U.S., you need to file a U.S. tax return, or you're subject to a 30% withholding tax on the rent. So that's a pain in the butt. So you elect it as effectively connected income in the first year. State tax of 11% is charged on every weekly rental that you rent out. So, and that's on short-term rentals. You must fumigate often. The bugs are big. Now, the bugs are not as big in Florida as they are in Mexico, but they're still a fair size. So I get a lot of people that say, well, I want to own this house on its own, not in a condo or anything else. I say, I hope you know how to do bug bombs and things like that, because you get a lot of bugs down there. The carrying costs, condo fees, taxes, insurance, hydro, can be very costly. So it's nothing to see condo fees on a reasonable place and property tax, et cetera, being $1,000 a month, so $12,000 a year.
Isn't that 2%?
Pardon?
Canadian? 2% in Florida, the taxes?
2% for Florida in...
Florida, for Canadians, is 2%.
Oh, for property taxes? There are 2 separate ways to calculate property taxes. So one of the things that are out there is if you're a resident of Florida, your property taxes are capped each year to a 3% increase. So when property values spiked huge, somebody would be sitting beside a Florida cracker who bought his place for $100,000, who's paying property taxes of $2,000 a year. The place is appreciated up to $1 million. They're paying property taxes of $25,000 a year. But what they do in Florida now, so everybody thought that was really unfair. All they're doing is doing exactly like they do here. They base their property taxes on assessed value. If you're a resident of Florida, full-time resident, then there's a limit on how much they can increase you for.
If you're Canadian, it's 2%. It's not 2%.
Not that I've ever seen. My taxes just go with whatever the assessed values are. So it just depends on what it is. They don't, They don't care. They don't even know I'm a Canadian. They just know I'm not a resident of Florida. So that's all that counts. Not your Canadian residency has nothing to do with it. So, hurricanes are something that everybody's worried about, I especially. If you buy newer, they're built to withstand most of the hurricanes, or use shutters and impact glass. I pay wind insurance. My wind insurance is $150 a year. I'm on the 5th floor because I bought the right kind of windows. Flood insurance, I'm on the 5th floor. I don't have any flood insurance. So my insurance is really cheap. So you can look at things like that. If you buy a house that's not up on stilts, you won't be able to get flood insurance, and your wind insurance will be huge unless you put shutters and a bunch of other stuff on it. So you have to be careful with that. Salt water and humidity is unbelievably hard on everything. Filing U.S. tax returns is a pain in the butt. Income is calculated differently. There are higher personal use reduces expenses more than for Canadian tax purposes. That's another thing that you have to watch out for. This looks funny, so essentially what I say is when you go to Florida, you don't want to bring Fifi all the time because gators and crocs kind of like small dogs. It's kind of funny. The same thing happens for anything like that. Whenever you're buying a property, I've got all these people that say, I back onto a lake and it's beautiful and there's a golf course back there and everything else. I say, I bet they tell you not to swim in the lake. They say, yeah, they do. Why is that? I say, because there's gators in the lake. Oh, okay. So you have to look at stuff, like get to know your property. It's really important. So buying a property can be painful, especially if it's a short sale. Once you make an offer, you don't know how long it will take to be approved. You should be careful about the following. Don't buy a house in a ghost town. Cape Coral, 17 years back, you can buy a house. There can be 3 of you on the street. Every year you have to replace your furniture. Why? When you go back down, they've robbed you. They've taken your furniture out of your house. So you have to be careful. Those deals that look like they're super, super deals are super, super deals for a reason. They're in the wrong neighborhood. So don't buy a house in a ghost town. If you're buying a condo, have your accountant review the condo corporation's books to ensure solvency, and review the condo corporation's minutes to see if there's any special assessments. We've done that with a couple clients. I've said, did you realize you're going to get a $20,000 special assessment like next year? Because this condo corp is bankrupt, basically. So you have to beware of all that sort of stuff. These are the swimming pigs. Oh, my God, I missed the swimming pigs. Hang on. These pigs come out to your boat in the Exumas where the Grand Isle Draw is. They come out to your boat and they beg for food. So you feed them. So they swim in salt water. It's really a bizarre thing. It's kind of neat. Okay, then my... No, they're not in Florida. Sorry about that. I've got a... By going backwards, I froze up. So we've gone through that. There's the swimming pigs. So these are the Bondy's laws of real estate. Location, location, location. It's easy to have... It's easy to get to. Like a lot of people have boat to properties in Muskoka. It's much better to have a drive to and a boat to, not the same. The less stoplights, the better. Small town environment. Safe for anyone to stay alone, even grandma. Always safer if it's just one road or limited access. The reason we love the Keys, there's only one road down to the Keys. Unless they can swim really fast, like there's no way for criminals to get out of there. So it makes it very safe. Access to airports, 1 or 2 hour drive, nearby to grocery and other necessities. Buy waterfront. I've had so many people come down and say, I can buy on a golf course. Isn't this a great idea? And I said, have you ever driven across the state of Florida? There's like 100,000 acres of land they could build golf courses till the cows come home. Waterfront is best. You'll pay more, but you'll get more in the long run. Fish when the fishing's good. This is out front of our place in Mexico. They can build a lot of golf courses in Florida. There are thousands of condos and properties not on the water that are extremely cheap. Buyer beware, you get what you pay for. In Canada, consider lake access. So buy across the street from the, or very near to the lake. Lakefront's is often too expensive. Okay, here's the meat of this. We're actually skipping our break and pushing on, which is strange. But the food's still back there, everybody. Florida, why did I do that? Is $150 per square foot for non-waterfront. Waterfront is $300 to $650 per square foot. Bahamas is 300 to 550. Mexico, 250 to 450. Toronto's 350 non-waterfront, 1,200 to 2,500 for waterfront. There's the disconnect. So the huge disconnect is what we're paying for cottages and properties here. This little fixer-upper happens to be the place where the alligator was underneath. Okay, so a spot like this in Florida will go for about $180,000. It's basically a trailer. So this is where I'm doing my comparison. This is $400,000, canal front in the Keys. There's your view of the canal, a boat dock at your back. Lovely spot. This is a place for $800,000 with a pool, a hot tub, and a 75-foot dock. There's the pool. There's the boat across the way. This is an $800,000 cottage in Parry Sound. So look at the comparison of the two properties together. Look at the place in Florida and the place in Parry Sound. Is Parry Sound closer? Depends, right? Not on a Sunday night coming back, it's not closer. This is a $900,000 property, a double lot, an infinity pool, 2 bedrooms, 2,700 square feet for $900,000. So there's lots of places. This is Grand Bend, 2-bedroom, $900,000. Grand Bend is on Lake Huron down near London. So as you can see, there's a big disconnect, in what you're paying for and what you're getting. So just watch that as you're going along. This is $3,500, 1 bedroom with an outhouse. Now, laugh as you may, this is the house we bought. So that's the house we bought in Mexico on the ocean, $3,500, and that's what we've made it out to be so far. And it's right on the ocean is about 100 yards away from that tree, basically. So, and that whole cost of building that place, altogether, we've got about $85,000 invested, including a boat and 2 cars and the house. And the house rents for $700 a week in fishing season. Yep. So this is Grand Isle. So there I go again. So this is Grand Isle, and that's a picture of the Exumas. And these properties are running between $600,000 and about $1.2 million. So this is where you can stay if you win the draw, if you put up with me or continue to do so. Isn't that interesting how that freezes on me? Next, here we go. So sale of U.S. property. It's taxable in the U.S. on your gains in U.S. dollars. If you own a U.S. property, you got a lot of problems. Withholding tax of 10% of the gross proceeds unless you get a certificate that allows less tax to be withheld, or a sale price under $300,000 and used by a buyer as a principal residence. So if a Florida cracker comes in and buys your place for less than $300,000, you don't have to pay tax on it in the United States. I don't know why. It doesn't make any sense. It's crazy. Keep track of your capital costs for tax purposes forever. Keep your original signed documents because you'll need them. You must file a U.S. tax return and get a refund. Death in U.S. estate tax. Obama passed it, so the exemption is now $5 million. It expires in 2013 with the fiscal cliff and goes back to $1 million unless they renew it. This is our dock in Key Largo. Estate tax returns are complicated and you cannot deal with it. You may be exempt. The problem with any U.S. property that you own is it taints your total investment that you have in the U.S. So if you have stocks of Apple, IBM, or different stocks that you hold directly, not through an ADR with your broker, your property in the U.S. and those stocks probably add up to more than $60,000 of value. So essentially, you're going to end up filing a U.S. estate tax return. You cannot touch that money in the bank or those shares until you've filed that estate tax return and gotten a release from the U.S. government. And that takes upwards of a year if you're lucky. Sometimes it's even more than that.
So let's say you own something worth $800,000 in the States and you have $400,000 worth of U.S. stocks in Canada.
Yep. Depends on your total net worth. So what happens is the stuff that's subject to U.S. estate tax is U.S. real property, vehicles, boats, direct shares of bond investments, etc., whether held personally or in your RRSP. So you have to be careful to clean everything. Do I really have to worry? Yes, because the IRS looks at your worldwide assets to see if you hit their limit. Their limit is $5,120,000 or $10.2 million right now. So remember, for estate tax, assets include life insurance policies. So I've gone through this with people before. I've said, if you have a significant net worth, you can end up paying a lot of money. There's that fish I caught, so that's the fisherman part of me. That's a marlin in Cabo San Lucas. So here's a simple example. The worldwide assets are $6 million. Life insurance is $2 million. Your total worldwide assets are $8 million. U.S. real estate, $1.5 million. U.S. investments and other, $5 million. Total assets, $2 million. Estate tax, $249,000, unless you have a spouse that you've transferred it to. Yes. But you have to be careful because in the U.S., they do things differently. So remember how we talk about joint property all the time? When people buy property in the U.S., they say, how do I hold the property? If you're not going to be fancy and use a trust or anything else, you have to hold it separately. So essentially, you hold it as tenants in common, not as joint tenants. If it's as joint tenants, it automatically transfers to the spouse, and you end up with this estate tax problem where you can't match everything up. So it's different than in Canada. It's totally different. So hold title as tenants in common and not joint, or as joint with a co-ownership agreement to sever your tenancy rights. There's no right of survivorship, but you need to prove that your spouse had the funds to buy the property. So husband can buy half of a $400,000 place. The wife has to show that she has $200,000 worth of value to be able to legitimately own it for U.S. estate tax purposes. And you have to document that. If you die 20 years later, you got to prove that she had the money to do it when she did it. Yes?
So when you make the comments for the U.S. assets of homeless tenants in common, wouldn't that just put you in a probate position?
Yes, in the U.S., but again, it's still worthwhile to do in most cases.
And maybe I'm not following. What's the reasoning behind as opposed to tenants in common as opposed to...
Well, what happens is that when I die, it's only my half of the property that comes into my estate at that time. I'll be able to use the exemption to get me out of filing or paying U.S. estate tax.
Is that because the IRS will deem the full value to be yours?
If it's in joint name, it'll deem the full value of the surviving spouse.
And my understanding on that is that it's more of a presumption. You can refute that.
Exactly.
So
Yeah, you have to show that they've contributed money to it.
So
Yep.
you could go in as joint tenants with the proper planning to show...
Well, you need to sever it with a co-tenancy agreement, though. So you need to have proof that, in fact, she put her money in.
So if
Yep.
you bought, that is tenants in common, one of the spouses dies,
Yep.
the other person sells property,
Yep.
they would only have property gain tax on
Well, when you die for tax purposes, for U.S. estate tax purposes, the spouse that's deceased uses that property and files it on their exemption. But because it's only half of the property, they're normally going to fall way under that exemption limit. So it's just a matter of keeping it as low as possible. There's no deemed disposition tax in the U.S. on the gain. So essentially in the U.S., it's stupid. You actually get a step up in your cost base in the U.S., but none in Canada for the same property. So you still end up, now the property transfers to your wife, so you still are exempt from capital gains tax in Canada, but you've mitigated your U.S. estate tax problem. So that's the only reason that you do it.
And can I just readdress the same issue where you're saying you have to show each spouse paid, for example?
Yep.
Is it enough to just show that each spouse technically had, say, 2 transfers from personal bank accounts?
Well, they have to,
Go back to show where that money
you have to show where the money came from, technically. Yes, sir. You guys are really good. Single-purpose corporations are dead, and they create all kinds of problems right now. In fact, what I've been doing is trying to get out of single-purpose corporations because the Canadian government has stopped allowing them about 3 or 4 years ago. So basically, a single-purpose corporation, there's the view from our condo down there. No. So what happens is that the single-purpose corporation actually is the worst of all worlds because a single-purpose corporation is what's called a C Corp in the U.S. Not half the gain is not exempt. 100% of the gain is taxable in the U.S. at U.S. corporate tax rates, which are like 37%. So it's the worst case you can ever get. So if you have a single purpose corporation, you should deal with it because they're no longer legitimate and they don't work at all anymore. Yes?
What about the use of a trust to hold the former property?
Yep.
Canadian resident?
I'm getting to that. So anyway, watch out. The other thing that used to work was what's called a non-recourse loan. So the only people that offer non-recourse loans are U.S. mortgage companies. So if you can get a U.S. mortgage, that'll help you a little bit because that'll offset the value of the property. It's not used commonly anymore. Watch for direct investments in U.S. securities, ADRs. U.S. securities held in Canadian corporations are not subject to estate tax, so that's where you want to do it. Single-purpose corporations no longer work. They're not eligible for half the capital gains tax rate in the U.S., so you actually end up paying a huge amount of U.S. tax. Do not use corporate ownership, as there is risk that if for personal use, to be deemed to be a shareholder payment and 100% taxable. So I've had lots of people say, I'll use a Canadian corporation to buy the condo down there. Well, they buy the condo. Technically, the minute they buy the condo, if it's for personal use and can't be shown to be for complete rental use, you can use it maybe 1 week a year or 2 weeks, squeak in a little bit. CRA can add the whole value of that condo to your income. So even though you've lent the company $300,000 to buy the condo, okay, the company buys the condo, CRA can go in and add $300,000 to your income that year. So a corporation doesn't work. I've had lots of people ask me about LLCs, limited liability corporations, because the Americans love their LLCs. An LLC is treated as if it's a corporation in Canada, so you're stuck by the same rules. So LLCs are like a no-no. All the advisors in the U.S. will say, yeah, own it with an LLC. And I go, oh, God, here we go again. So there's always problems with all this stuff. So, yes?
Assuming you have rental income and assuming there's legitimate rental income coming in, but assuming that it's highly unlikely that you'll achieve profits, given that it's the cost of ownership and everything down in the United States, how would your benefit be calculated? Is it on a is it a percentage of your cost, or do you have to default to a market-based rent if you're using it personally for 2 or 3 weeks a year?
So are you talking about owned by a corporation? Yeah. It's a real problem. My recommendation to most people is if you ever think you're going to use it personally or keep it personally long-term, don't put it in a corporation because it's just going to end up coming back to haunt you later on because the corporation will have to sell it to you. You'll have a gain in the corporation. So you end up like paying tax on top of tax on top of tax. So it really doesn't work very well at all. So it's really not good. And there are no rules about how to own it. Well, a lot of times people will put it in the corporation to start with, and then they'll say, well, now I want to use this place myself. And then their advisors will say, you have a taxable benefit of that whole value. So they'll say, buy it back from your corporation. Even if there is legitimate rental income, if you want to get the property back, you have to buy it from your corporation. Even for us, where we only spend a month a year down there, we're offside if we had it owned by a corporation. And your corporation then has to file U.S. tax returns. So it gets to be a real pain in the butt.
Why does the corporation have to file U.S. tax returns?
Because it's carrying on business in the U.S., effectively connected business, because it's a non-resident corporation, just like you're a non-resident individual. There's no way around it. It doesn't. Well, then you shouldn't own it in a corporation because they'll assess a taxable benefit of the whole value of the property. Come see me later. Exactly. Sell now when you can argue prices are low. Especially watch for LLCs, though, because everybody sells those.
I don't want to get too technical and Jake can bypass this one, but if you have a son or daughter that are U.S. citizens,
Yep.
That would work.
Yes.
In terms of putting their name and ownership, and then you can have.
Yes, technically they should contribute the money, but if you're not a U.S. citizen, you don't have gift tax. So, but you have to be careful. Once it goes to the kids, for the kids to get it back to you, it's subject to gift tax. So you got to watch it for U.S. citizens, and they're subject to U.S. estate tax and everything else. So it just gets to be a little bit complicated.
And sorry, I just want to pick your brain one more time back into the LLC for a moment.
If I can just skip through this, and then I'll let people go or have some, and I'll stick around for any questions and people that want to hear various different things. So basically, this is the Canadian Trust strategy used to confuse the IRS. So all the stuff that I've seen on this are things where And I may have actually skipped the one. No, I didn't. So what they do is you form a U.S. limited partnership owned by a Canadian limited partnership funded by a Canadian trust. Your costs are about $15,000 in legal fees and accounting fees to get all this stuff set up. And the IRS can still use their X-ray vision and look right through it all. So these work. I've used them a number of times on big properties where people are buying like a $3 million property, and I want to make sure that it doesn't go back to them as part of their U.S. estate tax or things like that. But so I've used these before, but most people just go, how much is it going to cost me on top of all my other expenses? And is it guaranteed? No, there's no guarantees. So that's one of the problems. So it just hides it. Again, a view from Grand Isle. So I'm just going to go over the Bahamas. The Bahamas are fairly attractive only for a couple reasons. You can get a Bahamian residency card. It's allowed if you buy a residence that's worth over $500,000 US. It cannot work unless there's a work permit that's obtained with it. As an island, the cost of living in the Bahamas are very high. It's all in US dollars. It's easy to own property and take title. They do not hassle you like the Americans do at all. It's very, very good for that purposes. Prices are still fairly high compared to the U.S., but have dropped dramatically. There are no U.S. tax problems and no income taxes. So there is a potential then. So nowadays, it used to be when I took people offshore that had sold a business or wanted to leave the country to get out of paying tax in Canada forever, I used to take them to the UK. The UK has become way too expensive because they have a non-domicile tax now of £30,000 per year minimum. So now I seriously look at the Bahamas instead because it's close by, there are flights all the time, it's safe, it's secure. The banking and investment community, you still deal with Scotiabank, you still deal with the same banks, everything works out very, very well. So for some of my clients that are looking at it, I sort of point them at a Grand Isle and I say, well, if you want to get started, you buy your property, get your residency, because when you leave Canada, you can't just leave Canada and go nowhere. You have to leave Canada and take up residency in another country, because on the checklist they ask you, they say, where are you going and are you going to become a citizen or a resident of that country? So the Bahamas is one of those places where it actually works. Again, Grand Isle. I'm past my time. Oh, I'm right on time. Look at that. So as I said before, I'm not going to go into Mexico very much. Mexico is cheap, but it's a different lifestyle down there. It's totally different and is costly and more complex than the U.S. So when people talk about it, I say, like, your legal fees and your costs of buying property are expensive for your transaction costs, but not for your ongoing costs. My burn rate in Mexico is $20 a day. My burn rate in the Keys is $200 a day. So it's kind of like the place where if you want to bail and live really cheaply, Mexico is the place to go because you can live for nothing down there. An 8-pack of beer is $7. I don't even know what it is. It's like $25 here. So anyway, so that's basically most of the presentation. And again, I'm not going to go through the Mexico stuff because people aren't concerned. It's all in there for anybody that would like to talk about it is good. And within your package, there are 2 tax people at the Toronto office of Collins Barrow that are very experienced in all these areas. One is Enzo Testa, and the other is Matthew Wilson. So if you have any questions or anything, and if you want to talk to one of them or me, just please send us an email, and we'll be able to help out as much as possible. We're now going to draw for the Grand Isle Prize. And sorry, people, there's lots of food back there, so feel free to hang around and ask questions.
A couple observations. One thing I note is that Mike is always helpful and willing to take follow-up questions, so he will stay around and answer some things. In case you didn't notice, he often references a good lawyer, for example, is one that tells their clients to talk to the accountant. So all of you are good if you say, and talk to your accountant. So it's been wonderful to work with Mike. He's happy to do things over the long haul for information purposes. You can contact me at the Ivey Business School as well for any matters related to advising business families or if you're a business family yourself.
going to put this slide deck online as well with some side interviews, question and answer things. And part of what I'm hearing is where do people sort of start focusing their questions, and we can do little snippets where we post those kind of things.
That's right.
So just to keep you here, we had this little lure. You're all legit, and I only have 7 family members here, so you should be No, I don't have any family members. I have Gurinder Sandhu. Do they have to be here?
Yes, they have to be here. Yep, they have to be here.
You hoping that's a gone?
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of people that didn't make it, I don't think. Hopefully we won't be here all night choosing somebody to...
Do they have to be seated?
No.
Mark Orland?
Oh, boy, I had a lot of people that didn't show up.
Dodging bullets. You are here? Uh-oh, sorry, it's the list?
Well, no, this is off the list. This is off the list if you signed up.